Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Tales and Tactics Beyond the Book, a show that breaks down the fundamental concepts behind tabletop games and how they are played. I am your host, Max, and joining me, of course, is Troy, and working behind the scenes is our producer, Jay. Today's episode is about time and distance and how it exists in games pretty well generally, but especially applied to role-playing games and war games.
This will be a look into the different dimensions of timekeeping and distance in our games, as well as how different games interpret that both thematically and mechanically.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good way. So with this Beyond the Book episode, as with all of the ones we do going forward, let's define our terms. So there are many ways that time is measured in and out of the game, or the meta versus the in-world interpretation of time. And this is really what we're concerning ourselves when we talk about time. So in RPGs, depending on what stage of the game you're at, you may clock in different levels of abstraction or specificity. So for instance, games have combat rounds, and they can be anywhere from 1 to 10 seconds, usually. And then that can, outside of combat, can either be completely free-flowing, or there might even be some constrictions around that. Usually we're dealing with ideas of shifts or quarters or hours. Occasionally whole days can be aggregated into sort of a single blur of things happening. How does that work in war games, Troy?
In war games, the round or turn can perhaps represent something longer, periods of several minutes to even hours, depending on the scale of conflict you're representing or simulating. And importantly, you can subdivide that into impulses or phase actions that allow you to represent different units of time within your overall scope. But in war games, you're going to find that because you're dealing with a larger picture and more participants in the fight, it's going to have a bigger interval of time management.
Yeah, and I think generally between RPGs and war games, there's a lot more of this sort of expanding and contracting that happens as you play the game, based on the amount of detail and different things that might be happening. In terms of board games, this can, unless it's a specific mechanic of a board game, generally is quite abstract. Usually it's only down to the matter of turns and rounds between different players and how each of those sort of progresses. In larger contexts for role-playing games, there are sometimes broader terms or sort of elements of time. These are things like sometimes are referred to as scenes, quarters, shifts. So I believe quarters sometimes comes from sports, and there are sport games that use this. Football is obviously a decent example. I don't see this that much. I think the example that comes to mind in tracking time in quarters of a day, as an example, is Forbidden Lands, which uses that as a way of calculating overland movement. But generally, I see this less the case. Another one that I've seen is shifts. And strangely enough, that also comes from a Free League game, which I think it comes from Alien. Well, not that it comes from Alien, but Alien seems to be one place that I've definitely seen it. From my understanding, shifts comes from naval shifts, which are about 8 hours long, and so it makes up thirds of a day. And that's coming from the whole thing that you would have an operating crew, and they would work for 8 hours, and then that crew would be on downtime, and then there'd be another third that would be sleeping, and then they would kind of rotate through this cycle. And that's where we get 8-hour work days, more or less. That and probably railroads somehow. And I've seen games handle hour cycles in a game with 8-hour jumps. So a day can be made up of early activity, late activity, and then downtime or sleep. And then a sort of final element on time-related stuff is that even really abstracted games like poker, they definitely have in-game terminology for time. Like, obviously, you're not playing a game where time in the game world matters because there isn't a game world. You're just playing cards. But there are betting rounds, there are rounds of dealing. So that sort of makes up 2 phases of play.
Right.
Especially, again, depends on the variation of poker you're playing. But if you take 5 stud as an example, you are placing an initial bet. Everybody goes around the table. So that's a round comes from usually going around the table. So everyone, it's considered 1 round when everyone is active. And then those rounds can be broken into phases or types of rounds. So there'd be 1 for betting, and then there'd be 1 for drawing cards and discarding cards. And then you could kind of say that every hand or every like full game, you could call it a game in and of itself, but a continued series of games could be considered multiple turns of playing with the same pot. Again, this is setting up the fact that the terminology around all of these terms is not fixed. I'm substituting different terms that would probably not be applied to poker, but that's how they might be interpreted if you were taking them from, say, a role-playing game like Dungeons and Dragons, depending on the edition, of course, on how they measure each person doing something and what is the frame or context for that happening. Distance, on the other hand, is a bit more measurable, but yeah, Troy, let's get into distance as a concept.
Distance can be broken down into what is your unit, your base unit of measurement. And one of the first and most obvious ones we're probably all familiar with is grids and hexes.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a way of subdividing out a map or a battlefield or an encounter space where you'll be able to draw your lines, your patterns, and move within set rules through them. Think of chess, think of checkers, right? Grids often are going to show up in RPGs and some war games. There is sort of a tradition of using grids for skirmishy actions, smaller scale things where diagonal movement isn't quite as disruptive to the scale of the moves you're making, if you know what I'm implying.
Yeah.
But this square grid makes movement and area effects easy to calculate, but you do still have to factor diagonal movement into that. But hexes are more popular at a strategic, operational, or a war game scale.
Mm-hmm.
And hexes eliminate the diagonal movement problem. And they're actually, they provide really natural movement. The only thing is that you can't line things up. Everything's always slightly askew. You know what I mean? If you're trying to make 2 battle lines collide. So that's just like the thing about hexes, they're a little unique, but they actually arguably are better than the squares.
Yeah. So I've heard this referred to in hexes as the hex orientation problem.
Yes, exactly.
So it's funny because who's that YouTuber? CGP Grey did a very fun video called Hexagons are the Bestagons. And he did touch on how they affect in gaming. But the thing that he failed to mention in that was what is called the facing dilemma with hexes, which is there is a clear flat side, which is the front line. So if you know which way the action is going to be happening, you want the top and bottom of the hex, the flat ends of the hex, to be along that lateral, because that means that units can move forward and then they move sort of diagonally left, right in either a back or forward motion. But you're right. There's this little quirk with hexes where they are technically better than a grid in some respects, but they're not perfect unless you know exactly what the line of movement actually is, or if the line of movement doesn't matter, like tactically.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing they share in common is they're both going to represent at least a standardized distance.
Yeah.
And you'll then maneuver either the cardinal directions or diagonal directions on a square, or at the hex, do the different facings. But these standardized units are going to represent different amounts of distance depending on the scale of game. So if you're looking at Dungeons and Dragons or a classic role-playing skirmish encounter, you're looking at 5 feet squares or hexes. That's very, very typical.
Usually, yeah.
If you get into a war game, however, you're really going to be looking at these different size units. Like, for example, it could be 100 meters. It's going to be something that would be like a squad frontage, because you'll probably be moving a squad counter from hex to hex to hex, right?
Yeah.
So it's 100 meters to represent the width and breadth of what that squad would be responsible for covering. And that it's pretty elegant to be able to use a grid and hex system, but there is, in contrast, a completely different approach where you use more abstract, irregular shapes that are not, they're not symmetrical, they're not patterned, and these would be zones. You see these more so in board games, but there's a
Right.
lot of more modern RPGs that do incorporate them, where you have these zones that you occupy, and then you can move into neighboring or adjacent zones or affect them. And you might have different distances within a zone, such as being in engagement range or being within short range, but still within the same zone. Or you might be considered at a medium range if they're in they being your target in a different zone from you. So it's another way to represent that. And it's a little more convenient for theater of the mind in some aspects, as you're not having to know the specifics of click, click, click on the grid.
It's a convenient way to abstract how far something is relative to its practical nature rather than, say, a numerical value.
Yeah.
And I find it useful to have some sense about how far that kind of is. So I think the typical zone effects that I know of are you have where your character is, then you have, I guess, what sometimes is called close range, where you can basically be in melee contact with that target.
100%.
You have short range, which is usually measured as being how much someone can move, so they can close that distance.
Yeah.
But they're a little too close to, I mean, they're probably they're far enough away to engage in range combat, but they might still have an advantage of evading you because they're almost close enough to come in and start engaging you in hand to hand. Then it's debatable whether there's a far range, because sometimes that's broken into medium and then long. And sometimes that can go as far as extreme range, or sometimes called far.
Yeah.
But sometimes all three, medium to extreme, can be far as well. It really depends on the system. In terms of board games, Grand Strategy typically uses a zonal system.
It does. Yeah, you're totally right. I mean, like some of the biggest ones would be Axis and Allies and Risk for some pretty beer and pretzel examples.
And those are like irregular spaces that I guess are more defined by the other zones that they touch.
Yeah.
If you want to make a numerical value for that, it's basically how many other zones are they in contact with. And then that shows the, you could say, the risk or control level of that zone.
And how many, basically it kind of breaks down how many facings it has relative to how many borders it's comprised of. You know, like that's why something like Kamchatka has, only certain value in the game because it only has like 2 borders?
Yeah, exactly. Or transversely, Germany is a nightmare.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's touching so many other things and it's almost landlocked, just barely not.
Exactly. Yeah, and when you get into RPGs, the way they look at time and distance is going to be different than their peer games, we'll call them, because they're going to abstract the concepts of time and distance to first and foremost facilitate the narrative, storytelling, and the gameplay of the party experience. So you can see time looked at in a few different ways in like the classic Dungeons and Dragons example, right? Because you'll have rounds and those will be, that's like 6 to 10 seconds, right?
About that.
Those are like subdivisions of a minute.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'll get into longer periods of longer periods of time to account for stuff like travel or more downtime style activities. And those could be like minutes if you're doing like room to room dungeon travel, like 10-minute intervals.
The exploration phase, I suppose, is what you're describing. It's a sort of the intermediate between combat and travel.
Yes.
Is sometimes called exploration, and I've heard it sometimes formalized as turns as opposed to rounds, as opposed to shifts or sometimes days.
Yeah, and that would apply to overland travel, hex to hex, as it were. And then if you have downtime activities, and this could be represented by some games calling them endeavors, other times it's just a conversation with your GM about what your character's doing between adventures. But that could even be, weeks or months.
That also sort of brings up the idea of parallel time. So one thing that can happen in some tables of downtime activities are solo adventures or duo adventures or smaller breakups of the party or even reconfigurings. And then that brings into the idea about when does this happen relative to, say, someone else doing it? And that could be a little bit tricky to coordinate, but it can be rewarding if you can pull it off.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it gets West Marchy when you're dealing with that, but I think that's really rewarding in the respect that time is an important aspect of maintaining the feeling and, I guess, weight of the setting.
Yeah, I think sometimes it adds a level of verisimilitude
Yes.
to your game that is maybe underestimated in a lot of cases.
It can be fiddly, right? And a lot of times, we collectively will leave that behind for something that's more accessible. But with something like time and distance, you actually get a lot of value out of grabbing onto them. Like distance, knowing how far something is and having that translate into a meaningful amount of time in terms of travel is both important in terms of, the characters, their lives, the world sort of having a sense of purpose, but also it does tie into this like Trek fantasy, this Fellowship of the Ring journeying.
Yeah.
And if you can just teleport between locations with this like indistinct amount of time spent on the road, I'm not as favorable towards that as actually knowing like this was 3.5 weeks and we went through rations. You don't necessarily have to count the rations. I'm not going that far, but there's a lot that you can really do by knowing distance. And a role-playing game will give you kind of usually two primary ways of looking at distance, like a combat encounter scale, which can be measured in feet or meters, like we were saying, right? Like those 5-foot grid squares.
Yeah.
But also you'll look at like 6-mile hexes being a classic for overland travel, where that will be what your map of the wilderness would be based on.
Yeah, it brings a lot to making that world feel as real as possible, even if it is a bit of consideration. But then there are games where that level of timekeeping might not be as necessary. Like I can think Troika.
Oh, good example.
Which is really super loose and almost works better if you treat it like some kind of bizarro fantasy world.
Yeah, it's got its Alice in Wonderland characteristics to the point where like almost keeping accurate time is against the spirit of the game.
Yeah, 100%. The influences that I get from the game, or at least having run it, what influences I think work best are definitely that sort of Wonderland sort of, it's almost fun to screw around with time and distance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Actually, a fun, slightly obscure thing, which I wish they would re-release or make a new edition of, are Call of Cthulhu's Dreamlands.
Oh, okay.
There's an amazing description of what it's like to travel through the Dreamlands, and I think it's lifted out of Through the Looking Glass, where you imagine the place that you want to be in your mind, and as you walk, you find yourself there. And the danger in that, and part of what makes traveling around in the Dreamlands so spooky, is if you don't know where you're going, you could end up anywhere. You could feel like you took I've been walking for several hours and you may have crossed like hundreds of miles somehow because your lack of knowing where you want to be is so blown out that you could be anywhere.
That's a good example of like an absence of distance still being very meaningful in a game.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things, like, I know not a lot of people are necessarily fans of that subsetting of Call of Cthulhu, but I think when they actually made that book, they did a good job of thinking about how that place should feel, right down to how far things are from each other, or not far for that matter, and what time feels like or doesn't feel like. Now, in terms of wargaming, this can really depend a lot on the game, but time is both much more fixed, and yet it has this expansion and contraction thing that happens. In a lot of war games, the action of doing things is you have an activation and you move the piece, and you move another piece, and your opponent is, depending on how turn order works, changing they're reacting to that either piece for piece or side for side, however that's done. And then we sort of need to imagine, most of the time, a lot of these things happening simultaneously. And sometimes there's like major shifts in the game, some mechanics. I'm thinking of Chain of Commands end of turn function
Oh, yeah. Perfect.
is being a really big one, where the turn ends and it's supposed that there's some kind of lull in the fighting, or there's some shift where nothing happens. And on the table, this means that smoke disappears, injured or downed commanders stand up again. There's a few other factors that might come in. It might trigger an event if it's a controlled scenario. But at the table, it feels like nothing except that these things happen. But what we'd assume in the game is that there's been a bit of a lull in the fighting. And that's kind of what I mean by that expansion and contraction, is that what we're doing is the same thing, but what's happening in the world is now beginning to kind of stretch out a bit.
Yeah, that's really true. There can be a sort of, I don't want to use the word inconsistent like it's a bad thing, but time can be recorded in sort of an inconsistent rhythm as to create the feeling of starts and stops that are described by the accounts of, modern combat, right?
Yeah. Bolt action is another sort of peculiar example.
Yeah, with the dice draw system, you're right.
Yeah, exactly. So like your opponent may draw like multiple turns in a row before you get any. And there is an assumption in that case that every time there is a drawn activation, that is time steadily moving forward. They're just being a bit more active than you are at that moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
How does that feel in a game like, say, Warhammer 40K?
Time in Warhammer 40K is super abstract because there's not really, like, I resolve the entirety of my turn sequencing, and then we have a shared fight phase.
Right.
And then you resolve the entirety of your turn, and then we have a shared fight phase. So the question you have to ask is, are these separate turns meant to be interpreted simultaneously? Or is there some amount of back and forth that you're supposed to just assume is implied by the ways the very rules work? And does that affect what the time means? Knowing what modern 40K is based on its origins in 3rd edition being a pretty much company level rule set, we can assume that turns are like 30 seconds to 5 minutes. And that's like about what you're dealing with, probably on the smaller side of that because the action's really ramped up. So things are like fast and brutal. But it is quite interesting that you're dealing with a definite tactical time scale, but it's hard to really define it because say there's a ruin structure. Infantry can move into and through that without penalty relative to a vehicle that cannot. So what is the time spent by that infantry getting into that ruin in their 6-inch move relative to the 6-inch move of infantry that doesn't move into a ruin? Like, you know what I'm trying to say with that?
Yeah.
So there's like differences in how it flows. And I think that's just because the game doesn't put that in the design forefront.
I mean, some of it is just sort of weighed down by the tradition of how things are done through previous editions.
Yes.
The fact that it uses a you go, I go, side for side activation is, I mean, by some people's standards, kind of primitive.
It's a little old school, that's for sure.
But because it scales itself around, basically it tries to tailor itself to being a competitive game, especially like more recent editions.
Yeah.
I feel that is more suited. But I think the thing that might lose is, as you say, like, how do you interpret those actions as far as like, I mean, I don't know that there's much care taken to interpreting what is happening.
That's the thing. Like,
I feel that game is a lot of playing chess with fancy figurines.
That's not wrong. Because like in a game like Chain of Command or a World War II game or an Ancients or Napoleonic, whatever, there's a lot that you want to know about the process to reaching your outcome. As opposed to a game like 40K or Age of Sigmar or a lot of these more fantasy sci-fi games, you're drawn to the outcome. So the process to getting to the outcome is a little open to interpretation. Like in a World War II game, you're going to suppress the squad, but how you suppress that squad is important and influenced by our knowledge of history and tactics. In a game like 40K, you might have just had the suppression outcome. You know, I don't think 40K, it'd be battle shock, but you know what I mean? Like you might be able to trigger that, and it wouldn't necessarily be because of something as specific as, oh, my LMG was able to put this much firepower down range and suppress them. It'd be more like a keyword that would trigger based on circumstance. And that's totally valid and cool for what it's representing. But you are losing the process and focusing on the outcome.
Yeah, it's definitely very outcome focused. And even looser games, like as you sort of, again, you're more familiar with these games than I am, but like Age of Sigmar has a lot of those sort of same ideas of it being a little bit more outcome focused. There's more flavor maybe in that game.
That's what it sells itself on, is a lot of like the style and flavor for sure. It's not style over substance, because there's a lot of like play that you can get out of the tactical nuance.
Mm-hmm.
But like your spear formation has a +1 rend, so penalty to enemy armor save when they're charged. And that is built into their spear formation, not because the models are occupying a physical formation. The models can be standing however you want within their cohesion limitations,
Mm-hmm.
and still have the spear defense as if they were in a phalanx, right?
Right, yeah.
Some games will force you to literally put the models into a phalanx, like Clash of Spears, for example.
Right.
Published by a pair of brothers for sale through Victrix. It's an amazingly cool fantasy skirmish and primarily historical skirmish game. And it is like your dudes have to be exactly positioned for you to be able to take advantage of formational play. But to compare that again to Age of Sigmar, if they have the keyword, it doesn't matter how they're standing, they have the keyword, so they can use it. So it's not to compare and contrast as to create like a value proposition, but it's to highlight like one of them is focused on that process, because that process is what we're here for.
Yeah.
The other one is focused more on the outcome. And to be honest, like in a fantasy game, we don't really have a historical example to base a process on, if you know what I'm saying. Like, we can't just say like, well, we know at the Battle of this, orcs fought like this. We don't know that because that never happened.
Yeah.
So it focusing exclusively on a flavorful outcome kind of makes sense. And the way that it interfaces with both time and distance is to give you those outcomes, as opposed to a more detail-oriented game, which would be very much like an inch is 6 yards. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly. It's more positional. In fact, a weird one to explain with like how distance can be really abstracted in something like a war game. I guess two sort of paralleling examples that they're very different from each other would be Mordheim, which is like very man-to-man, or by that same extension, Necromunda.
Yeah.
Where it's very much a reach out and touch somebody game.
Yes.
And what you're positioned next to, behind, or around is a big factor. And it can be a little fiddly, particularly with Necromunda, but that can be rewarding, as opposed to a game like 5 Parsecs from Home.
Right.
Or any of those other games where terrain and distance mean something, but they don't mean as much.
Yeah, they're just more to like provide a modifier. They don't as much like it's the thing in some of these like in a role-playing game, and a game like 5 Parsecs hybridizes a war game and a role-playing game in a really creative way.
Yeah.
But it also does sort of take on some of the RPG encounter logic, where terrain is something to dance around as opposed to like an intrinsic thing you will occupy in fight and die over, like more of a historical game.
Right. Yeah.
Like think about the farmhouse, right? In a lot of sci-fi games, the farmhouse is an impassable obstacle, and you will fight around it and perhaps through it, but you won't really have an impression of what it is. But compare that to some of the games we've played of a historical title, like, again, to go back to the classic Chain, you'll be fighting room by room, and the specific window that you can get your weapon into will matter. And that is really rewarding. But again, that's, deep down the fiddly path.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, the way we handle that situation is sometimes very mathy. Like, oh, there are 10 guys in this room and there's 6 windows and 2 men can stand at each window. I'm not really going to position them as such, but I understand that it's 2 guns to a window.
Yeah, exactly. There's just this cafe me and Darren have on our table set up that has a window looking out of a sort of a diagonal facing.
Oh, yeah.
And that knowing who has that window is very important. And it just creates a lot of interest by having the specificity of those details.
Mm-hmm.
But you're in the middle of all that, you know? But if you want to compare that to something that's completely different, you could say something like a board game.
Right.
And that's going to be wildly different in terms of the level of abstraction that it incorporates.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that it won't use like finite units of measurement, in like down to seconds or down to feet, but it tends to handle stuff. Like we covered the Starship Troopers board game, right?
Yep.
How that handles combat is in these 10 to 30-minute turns that you don't see any of what happens underneath that time sequence. Like you can assume, the troopers are reloading and firing and they're fighting the bugs and so much is happening, but all you are doing is making a roll.
Yeah. And probably a sequence of rolls depending on how you've set up your attack.
Exactly.
And also that each one of those hexes is like miles across.
Yeah.
And yet, like a lot of these units, like mobile infantry in that game, move really fast. I think that's one of the things that kind of gets into your head. It's like, wow, these guys are ripping across the landscape. So there is an immersion factor even when you're at that level of abstraction. It's just, what does that mean in terms of how the game plays out in your head? And how does that, because I actually think that the time and distance as a concept and how it's handled in a game is very much the glue, or maybe in a different metaphor, the lubricant between the gears that connects the what is happening to how it's happening. Like the rules versus the outcome that you imagine is going on.
Mm-hmm.
Because like if you're playing Risk, there's just huge troop movements. Like you literally think of moving into an opponent's territory as a whole war, not even a battle, like multiple battles.
Yeah, 100%.
You might represent one role as a battle, but you probably will be attacking persistently on that one country until something changes. So yeah, like grand strategy, you imagine it, but it's almost like a montage in a movie than specifically a scene.
Yes.
And so like, again, this kind of touches back into what we were talking about last episode with scope and scale. Time and distance are essentially a further breakdown of those concepts because they do affect how we think about it. Scale more associated with distance and scope more associated with time. But these are kind of the clutch smaller terms within those terms. It's kind of how it's more of the rubber hitting the road for the game mechanics.
Yeah, yeah.
So let's get into some of the examples, I suppose.
So to get into our first example, we can talk about one of the key examples, in fact, Dungeons and Dragons. And Gary Gygax, he talked a lot about time management. The concept of Gygaxian time priority really comes into effect where he says you're not going to have a meaningful game if there's no time being tracked, if that's not being measured by your dungeon master and being felt by your players.
I mean, I think, as we've said, depends on what sort of game you're running and how long you might be running it. Like a one shot, I probably aren't. I might be somewhat aware of the time that passes, but unless we're moving out of the area and traveling a long distance, might not matter that much. And there's whole sessions out there that don't pay heed to the time thing. But I do think that, especially in the AD&D, the first edition AD&D book, he does make out a pretty good, if not a little bit vague, argument for why time tracking is of value in a role-playing game, especially if the focus of the role-playing game is travel or adventure, etc. D&D is weird in the sense that right from the beginning, it uses both grid / measured distance, because obviously its pedigree is a war game, but this is the first of its kind. But then it also uses hexes for overland travel that are taken from Outdoor Survival by Avalon Hill, like verbatim. Well, not verbatim. Obviously, the encounters would be different because that's more about sort of contemporary survival in the wilderness. But yeah, it's funny because I mean, very much in the old D&D fashion, it kind of makes do with what it has around it. It just sort of, oh, that's a cool idea from a war game or from like chainmail, and we'll adapt that into this. And I think it's only by the time you get to first edition AD&D, and in a different sense, the basic set, the Holmes basic set, which came at the same time, and thank you for the commenter that pointed out that I wasn't clear on that. There's this more of a codifying of those concepts and rules, but oddly enough, they still hang on to this idea that grid-based movement will be handled one way and not another. Oddly enough, though, they do talk about how the measurement is 5 feet, but then it's also a grid, and it doesn't seem to definitively say whether we're free moving or we're grid moving. Yeah, that's an odd example, but I think it's a good early starting point. As an interesting example of time management, I think that this is adopted in partly from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, but you do see it in 3rd edition D&D, is this more clear codification of types of actions that can be taken in a round. So in Wolfrap, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, 2nd edition at the very least, if I can remember, you are breaking actions down into full and half actions. And then there's some notion of free actions as well. But this is very good because then I know I can either do 2 half actions or 1 full action. And usually moving and attacking are considered a half, but casting a spell would be full. And this in the past has been, we'll get into other examples of how this is sometimes handled, and it can be really noodly. And then movement in Wolfrap is not really described as being on a grid. It actually does kind of dig into its wargaming roots and just tell you the distance, usually in yards.
It does. You're right.
So it's kind of like, yeah, here's how far you're moving. You figure out how you want to represent that.
Yeah, it to me, it's like, it is really throwing you the theater of the mind suggestion with that, by not giving you a gamist approach to encounter movement and spatial reckoning. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's much more narrative. You can break it down to inches and play it like a game of Warhammer Fantasy Skirmish from like 6th ed if you want to do that, or Mordheim, like if that's your thing.
Yeah.
But because of the way that game flows, and you know what, I gotta admit, I tried to play Dark Heresy back, like, I'm talking a decade and a half ago, as a skirmish game, and it didn't really click as much as I thought it could. So I don't know that that's really what I would take away from it, but being able to have these very understandable units of measurement, but leave it in the theater of mind so that people can still freeform at the table or freeform over the VTT or what have you, but you still can all understand, the radius or the range of things,
Yeah.
If you compare that to Imperium Maledictum, the 40K sci-fi version of effectively the same rule set, that's gone to zone control. So it's no longer measured in yards or meters. It is zonal relation to each other.
I think that makes sense I don't mind zone-based because it does lean itself to theater of the mind. But when you're dealing with a world that is, geographically as complex as Warhammer 40,000, abstracting distance is probably a good idea.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You want to describe like, oh, there's somebody on the catwalk above you and all this other stuff. But like, you don't want to have to think about the intricacies of moving through like a Forge World factory.
Yes, exactly.
Imagining all of the nonsense in the actual terrain. And we're just talking about probably flat ground with machines on it. But like, there's a lot of detail that you don't want to tactically think about except the fact that it's there.
Yeah, exactly.
Is it in my way? Is it not in my way?
Exactly. The Mr. Pink question. And I would say the other thing that WIFRAP does really cool is the endeavors, the downtime time management.
Yes.
That is something that Cubicle 7, the publishers and the developers of 4th edition, are kind of known for. It's something they put in a lot of their games. They even put it in other people's games for them in supplement books.
Yeah.
So they love it. But like some of the endeavors are really creative and really cool. Like if you have a lot of money, you have to, like, say you've successfully plundered some type of dungeon or ruin. You can take the banking endeavor, and that'll give you different ways to save that money and prevent your GM from being able to, weasel it away from you.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the ones I really like is going with like a mob bank,
Mm,
and then you have the risk of them getting busted and going under.
yeah.
So like there's so many cool, flavorful things that enrich what your characters are doing. And it fills in this time that if you were to do it in a moment to moment capacity, like thinking about it, like, okay, on Wednesday I'm doing this, and then on Thursday I'm doing this, it's harder to interpret and process. But if you're thinking of it like, okay, I'm setting up a bank account with the mob.
Yeah, it gives you some keywords to kind of strap that abstraction together and being like, oh yeah, so this is what I was doing with my free time.
Exactly. So it's really interesting. I love the Endeavors. I like their appearance in the various Cubicle 7 games. And I have to admit, I've only run one campaign that's gotten to a natural enough breakpoint with characters intact to be able to take an Endeavor.
Yeah.
But it feels really fun that and it kind of, the random event we rolled for right before the Endeavors were selected has determined what the next chapter of the campaign is even going to be.
Yeah.
So it really worked out in a kind of dynamic way that I quite enjoy. And that's a way that you can have a meaningful interaction with time that doesn't require intense calendar management.
And there can be some consideration for how long that takes, but you're right, it's a lot more open-ended. It's taking days at least. The first time I remember encountering Endeavors as a concept, and very true to this company's form, sounds better on paper than it does in practice, is Fantasy Flight's Rogue Trader, a game rich with ideas and really enticing to play and super complicated and clunky to actually play. I honestly think if you got Maledictum and then you picked up those Rogue Trader rules, I think you'd be able to work out a much smoother way of playing that. But that was the first time I encountered Endeavors as a concept.
I think to contrast with big time of Endeavors, we can move on to the smallest time frame possible, a base time unit of 1 second in the venerable RPG GURPS.
So GURPS is the originator of a lot of what I would call modular thinking in games, in role-playing games specifically. This is most indicative in how, one, it uses hexes to measure everything. The most frequent time I've encountered the hex facing issue, because which way is the front of the battlefield when you're in a skirmish is not easy to determine. But you can use it theater of the mind. But the real wild one to me, and I have my theories about what this is trying to do and some games that might do it better, is the base level of time is 1 second.
It's crazy.
What can you do in 1 second? Well, you can kind of start doing something. And I know that you can run GURPS different ways. There's obviously like GURPS Lite, which has a bit more of that move and act kind of feel, but it's still going off that basis of original GURPS being very molecular. It makes the whole thing feel like it's moving in slow motion. I don't know that I've ever played a game that really gave me the feeling that like the entire fight was in a slow motion action sequence.
Right, like you're fighting underwater and you can see every punch telegraphed 100 miles away.
Yeah, exactly. And I know that like there's a lot, obviously it's GURPS, there's a lot of additive and retractive mechanics. It's just funny that this is like the complete other way. Now, a game that isn't GURPS, though there is a campaign setting in GURPS or supplement book that supports this, but another Steve Jackson game that works better on that second by second is Car Wars. Because when you're driving at 90 miles an hour in an arena, 1 second actually does mean a lot of decision making, and it might be the least you could actually do. What am I going to do? I'm going to turn, I'm going to drive straight, I'm going to fire my weapons. Like, those are 1 second decisions. And, reaction time by the driver is a factor in the game, and also the handling. And I think that's kind of where Steve Jackson's mindset comes from. It's trying to, I don't think it's trying to do this, but it's doing something that in RuneQuest is actually done a lot better.
I super agree.
because it's framed differently, not because it actually functions differently, because it can make it feel a little bit slow motion. But Troy, maybe you can get into what we're getting at.
So in RuneQuest, we have strike ranks, and your turn in an encounter is subdivided into these. Almost think of them as like faces on the clock, and you go through your strike ranks each turn in sequence, and at each strike rank you check and see. Strike rank 2. Does anyone have any actions that would have them go now? NPC or PC, and you work your way through the encounter. If you're doing something like pulling back a bowstring and firing an arrow, it'll be quick. That's only a few strike ranks. But if you didn't have your bow at the ready, you're going to add ranks to your overall action, and you're going to take that later in the round sequence. So it has this similar incremental progression to building up to your action.
Yeah.
But it's way easier to grab a hold of the pieces, the blocks they give you to do it with, because there's only like 8 or 9 strike ranks in a round. So it's much simpler. And I have really enjoyed the process of dueling in RuneQuest, where you have like a one-on-one between 2 warriors, and you're really like feeling out, what do you have time to do? Do you have time to recover the blade that you dropped? Do you have time to draw your dagger? Like, how do you interpret the moment-to-moment action is really rewarding. And again, it's that process focus, not that outcome focus.
Yeah, it's it puts you right in the moment when those things happen. Just as a sort of side point before we move away from RuneQuest, because that's effectively the one of the key selling features. And in fact, I think that those, if you have a duel in Call of Cthulhu, grab those rules. Not that happens much, but it could. Another interesting thing about RuneQuest's setting, and this is true of Warhammer Fantasy as well, is the very old style bespoke calendar where there are things like days of the month or days of the year that don't land inside a month. So you'll have like feast days and other sorts of things that are not actually within a single month, but are some kind of transitional day that happens between them. And it just, that's another one of those things where time adds a lot of flavor, because, we might be starting on New Year's, and in, say, Warhammer Fantasy, that's a day that's not the first month. It's somewhere between the last month and the first month. Another system that does kind of what RuneQuest does, but a little bit different, but it's sort of in the same spirit or trying to solve the same sort of problem, is Sasquatch Games Alternity. So Alternity is a game that was made or a system and a setting that was created by TSR at the end of its life cycle, and then was reproduced by Sasquatch Games. And it's an interesting system. I'd like to try it. It certainly has an interesting dice system, but it has this shift between scenes and rounds being broken down into what they call impulses. And there are 8 impulses, and it's basically the same idea as strike ranks, but a little bit more freeform, kind of, where you know that certain actions will take a certain number of impulses, and you can choose, depending on your initiative, when you act. So you can delay your action to sync it up with another character's action. This gets a little noodly, but it is basically the same idea as strike ranks. I just thought it'd be interesting to have a sci-fi example, because Alternity is a sci-fi setting.
Yeah, it's very similar to strike ranks. It really is, but it's a little more modular.
Yeah, and it's fixed to 8, which I think the way RuneQuest does it, it really depends on who has the most strike ranking ability. It can change the total number, or how many combatants. I can't remember exactly how it worked.
Now, next up is a game that we've talked about before in Scope and Scale, but I wanted to bring it up again in Time and Distance, because it takes the Endeavors concept and goes further with it. This is the One Ring, the J.R.R. Tolkien Middle-earth strategy game, role-playing game. I mean,
those exist too.
Yeah, that's a different game. And in this one, you will have seasons pass, and there is a Yuletide season that acts as an extended downtime where your character will be able to progress in certain ways and even age. And this game has aging. It has heirs that you appoint that will take over your adventuring when your first character reaches a certain I guess, a certain age or a certain limitation. And this is all in service of the narrative that really suits the Middle-earth feeling, like Bilbo passing down to Frodo as he's aged and gone on from his adventuring time to now his nephew's adventuring time.
Yeah.
And that is really well captured. And also the long-term travel and journey plotting, that, you feel the distance because time is progressing. You're rolling events as you make your trek. So it's creating this chronology of your journey, again, giving you that sense of time, distance, and making that meaningful to the actual role play you're playing out.
Yeah, for sure. There is a similar mechanic in our next example, which is the game Pendragon, which is a weird role-playing game. I'd love to try it, but it's definitely, at least the original game is less freeform than most. But it also has this idea of playing lineages and ages, and the idea that like there are heraldries that you're not just playing one character in a sense, or you might, but then there's also these fated moments, these points where you're going to end up in this situation, and it's partly about sometimes you don't have much decision making in that.
Yeah, like some of the battles.
Yeah, exactly. Like, oh yeah, my guy's going to get killed at this battle because that's how it works. But I will be succeeded by whoever. And there's a lot more of a grand sweeping Arthurian narrative that runs through that game that it might fall onto a lot more. And there are certainly other games that use those kinds of mechanics. It's also got other mechanics in it that lean into that. But it does fit the feeling. It just feels a little bit like a roller coaster ride and less like a sandbox.
Yeah, I agree with that. Another game that's famous for being a total sandbox, and the sandbox even starts in your character creation, would be Traveller. And in Traveller, you have a life path style system that you embark on in character creation. And this is a way to abstract time, not in terms of playtime, but in terms of your character's very backstory.
Mm-hmm.
And by breaking that out into these different phases, I mean, it's kind of central casting like in a lot of regards.
Yeah, if anyone gets that reference.
Yeah.
But, yeah. Oh, I'm going to refer to this well-known game by comparing it to a really obscure game. Or it's not even a game, it's a tool. Do look it up. It is interesting.
But with the way that works, it gives you these characters that are so interesting and can have these different avenues. I mean, Traveller's famous that your character can die in character creation, or at least they could in a prior edition.
Yeah, earlier ones, yeah.
So, like, that's kind of an extreme example of this, but the way in which your character's experience can relate to the age that you sort of play out in this sort of macroscope way.
Also, when you're dealing with like really big scales of things, there's really, especially with distance, but also in a lot of terms of time. And this will actually tie back to the example you had in One Ring, but Mighty Empires and how it measures time and distance.
I love that game.
Yeah. I wish there was a more modern and smoothed out version of it, but yes, it is an amazing idea that is definitely playable.
Yes. Something that you want to mine for ideas and would love to play if there was like a way to have the components without going on eBay for it. But
it's also simultaneously too much and not enough.
I know, I agree. But the way that gives you these monthly turns, this sort of annual cycle, and then a final seasonal action phase in the winter months, it's so cool. It even talks about writing a campaign journal and calendar system for yourself, like the Year of the Red Griffin. Like, it's so cool how it lays out approaching time management in a strategy game, because it adds a sense of weight to know that it took me 3 years to finally crush this rival empire, or it was 6 months to get through the mountain pass because of bad rolls, or all these different experiences are given a sense of reality because of that. And Mighty Empires, yeah, it's fiddly and you're tracking a fair bit, but man, is it cool when that pays off.
Well, it is very like Golden Age Games Workshop kind of game. So it if it's bad, it's still beautifully bad.
Exactly.
But just for a little bit of further context, Mighty Empires is essentially the closest thing that Games Workshop has to a grand strategy game, unless I'm forgetting something really obscure. It started off as how the game designers would track the campaigns of their Warhammer battles, if I remember.
It's an amazing Warhammer campaign system. I've seen it adapted to Napoleonic era pretty readily, and for medieval era, there's a few different variants.
It's a good form, generally.
Yeah, for sure. And it was even made, again, for War Master, as opposed to classic fantasy battles.
Yeah, and it's very robust, and it's deep with ideas. And you can adapt some of those ideas if you wanted to do mass or military combat in a D&D campaign. It's actually not a bad reference. Wouldn't be the only reference I'd have, but it's not a bad one. And then the last example I have, which just puts it right on the nose and really flavors that particular game, is Troika's initiative system and time.
Yes.
So this is done by taking a bag and having tokens related to the enemies and player characters. And some abilities will give you more than one token. Additionally to all of these tokens is an end of round token. And it doesn't matter when that comes out. That's when all the chits go back in the bag, and there's a sort of a lull or assessment of what's going on. And some people may have acted multiple times, but it's over, and now you have to rethink the strategy, and it's super random. And that's part of what's fun, because you have no idea what's going to happen. And in a game that treats time in a very open-ended and loose way, it really helps that feeling. Might not be everyone's cup of tea, but...
Yeah, I've seen that mechanic in a war game like I Ain't Been Shot, and I love to see it in a role-playing game, because it just has, like, it's my favorite thing, friction.
Yep.
Just adds that element of unpredictability and chaos that makes the encounters just that much more rewarding to survive.
So we covered a lot of topics here, from obviously mostly role-playing games and war games, though we did touch on how these things might expand into at least hex encounter games and grand strategy. But yeah, time and distance play a huge part in how your game feels, whether you choose to be very detailed or totally abstract about it. There's a lot of interesting decisions out there, and there's a lot of games that handle those decisions really differently.
Absolutely.
I think it's important. Whatever way you decide to handle it, it's worth considering.
Whatever way you decide to handle it, it's absolutely worth at least handling it somehow.
Yeah. So what's next week's? You're picking this one, I think.
Next week, we are going to dive into the sister game of Chain of Command that we talked about in this episode. We will be doing a breakdown, rules as written, on Too Fat Lardy's Dux Britanniarum, a Dark Age game about Arthurian Britain and the kings and war bands that define that era. So it is one of my personal favorite war games. It's been around now for over a decade, but I think some of the ideas in it are still as fresh as ever, because people have not been able to find more efficient or creative ways to resolve some of the kingdom management aspects of that game. So really excited to talk about it.
Yeah. All right. Well, until next time, happy gaming and take care.
Have a great one.
We hope you enjoyed delving in today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on our website, neonlithicinteractive.com. Join us again on the next episode of Tales and Tactics.